What is going on YouTube? So some of you may remember us from not too long ago where we covered a couple oversimplified. I've done Henry VIII. We did American Revolution. We've done a few. So we're back. We got an overwhelming recommendation to cover the Civil War. We've also had a lot of you guys talking shit. Like she doesn't see all the comments, but oh my God, it was like, oh, when you said that, or you're historians, like, oh my God. I think it was something you said about the Indians or something and like the Trail of Tears or I don't know. But let's talk about this whole historian thing real quick because you'll notice it says we're historians. We're married historians, right?
Yeah.
And what that means is she has a master's degree in history, basically, with a specialization in what would you say? Like
American history. Concentration in early American history through the Civil War.
There you go. And also some like 1920s prohibition.
I did
stuff.
some women's history.
Yeah. And then, well, and also like
I
the gangsters,
right. I
Day
personally
Massacre or
like to
something.
go through World War II, but it's just they call it American History 1.
Yeah.
I could teach.
Yeah. And then myself, I have a bachelor's and, I studied mostly medieval. But again, what that means is like when you take your classes or do you like your little publications or your papers, you have heavy focuses in certain little areas.
Right.
And God, how long has it been? Like it's been a decade. Like
14 years since I got my bachelor's.
Yeah.
11 years since I got my first master's. And
Yeah.
9 years since I got my second one.
so a long time, right? So I guess what I'm getting at is just chill the fuck out. I get. Well, sorry, but you know what I mean. Like we remember most of it. Some of it's hazy. But we'll do our best to. We happen to know a decent amount of it. She knows more about Civil War than I do. But hopefully we could do it justice to where we don't get too riddled in the comments. But for oversimplified, this is like going to be an hour-long thing because there's two parts. First part is 30 minutes. Second part's like 20 minutes or something.
But see, the Civil War was a very complicated war. And you know what's awesome?
What?
2 of the houses that were like on Gettysburg battle site, you can rent them like Airbnb now.
Wow.
And I'm like, what?
Couple of ghosts in that one.
Hey man, next year maybe for our anniversary.
Maybe.
Okay, Mrs. Lincoln, this is it. One last push, and we're done.
Ping! Well, that's not bad.
9 months and 4 days ago, my father brought forth upon my mother himself, and gave to her a child, conceived in a shack in Kentucky, and dedicated to the proposition that I will drink num-nums from a bottle and do little poo-poos in my pantses for the next 2 to 3 years. Now what is it babies do again? Oh yeah. I am not touching that. Abraham Lincoln grew up with his relatively poor family in Kentucky, eventually moving to Indiana, and finally, Illinois. He read a lot of books, worked a lot of jobs, wrote some questionable poetry, and finally entered the law profession. Despite being self-taught, he turned out to be a pretty clever and astute lawyer. In one case, a guy claimed he witnessed a murder at night, and Lincoln was like, "How could you have seen anything in the dark? There was a bright full moon." A what? A bright full moon. Can you say that again, please? There was a bright full moon. A dim half moon? No, a bright full moon. That's funny, because according to this almanac, there was a dim half moon that night, which makes you a liar. Well, I got a bright full moon for y'all right here. Now that's what I call a rebuttal. Lincoln and his cheekbones weren't only interested in law, however. He also dabbled in the world of politics, serving as a legislator in both local and national assemblies. And what a time it was. Not even 100 years after the Founding Fathers wrote all men are created equal, politicians were already asking, yeah, but what does that mean exactly? It means all men. Yeah, but what does that mean exactly?
All men.
And not just that. States' rights versus the federal government. What are the executive powers of the president? Is cereal a soup? The Founding Fathers left some of these questions perhaps a little too open to interpretation. And the biggest question of them all was slavery, an ugly mark on what should have been a revolutionary new nation based on liberty and democracy. Thomas Jefferson had written a condemnation of slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but out of fear of losing Southern states' support, it was removed. Hey guys, do you think leaving this a little vague will create any unforeseen problems in the future? Cannonball! And those unforeseen problems were now beginning to rear their ugly heads.
Let me just say really quick, there is actually, so that show we used to watch, was it Adams? John Adams.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
There's a great part in that where he does write a part about slavery and this and that. And Benjamin Franklin looks at him and he goes, we're just not ready for that yet. And a lot of it did have to do with Southern support, right?
because if you didn't have, when they were writing the Declaration of Independence, if you didn't have a cohesive 13 states, it wasn't going to, or colonies, it wasn't going to work, because then you've got one that's kind of loyal here, and then everybody's like, well, if they're, I want to do my own thing. You needed everybody to unite. And so, yeah, that was, but Jefferson, which is the irony, being a slave owner, wanted freedom for all people.
Yeah. Yep.
As the nation developed, the North and the South developed along two very different lines, and two very different cultural identities emerged. Northern cities began rapidly industrializing, while the southern climate allowed for
Zombies.
large plantations of labor-intensive crops. As a result, one half of the country didn't rely on slaves, while the other half had become economically dependent on them. In 1793, Eli Whitney's cotton gin
Okay.
caused the slave trade in
Because I'm over here nodding yes, and you're saying no. Why?
That's not entirely true, because
Why?
there were slaves in the North.
Well, there were.
And before, the amount of plantations and slave owners was very minimal compared to the whole of the United States, because A, slaves were expensive, and B, you had to really be wealthy in order to have land and the ability to support an entire group of slaves.
Well, that's true.
So it was a very small percentage of the population, very, very small percentage of the
Yeah.
population that actually owned slaves.
But the part that I agree with, though, is like you said, the North, even though they had them, their infrastructure didn't depend on them.
Well, because they were able to see, if you look at a map too, the states are much smaller with the
Yeah.
exception of New York and Pennsylvania, but it was very much industrialized. And so the North depended on the South to get their raw material. So the North couldn't have produced anything if it wasn't getting the raw material from the South.
Yeah, it's
No,
gonna
the
take
South
a.
to
everyone was-
explode, while in the North, a growing abolitionist
definitely more
movement
spread out,
was
for sure.
taking root. A general mistrust began to develop between the North and the South, as Northerners felt the South were hell-bent on expanding slavery, and fear spread throughout the South that the North wanted to take their slaves away. In 1819, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states. A perfect balance. A happy medium. A harmonious relationship. Hey guys, nice to meet you. I'm Missouri, and I would like to
Yeah, the
become
Missouri
20th
Compromise.
Compromise.
Hey buddy, welcome to the nation. We'll be happy to accept you as a free state. Oh no, you don't? You're trying to get one over on us. Missouri's gonna be a slave state. Okay, listen, why don't we just ask Missouri what it wants to be, and we slave state. Well, then,
Slave state.
Allow me to introduce to you the newest, freshest state on the scene, Maine. Hey, you can't do that, and you can't have any more slave states above this line. What? The issue of slavery is solved, and it will never come up again. A few years later, it came up again. You see, as America expanded westward, each new state or territory that was added threatened to upend the delicate balance between the slave and free states. If one faction managed to outnumber the other, it could gain an easy majority and force its own ideals on the opposing side, leaving a huge portion of the population feeling spiteful and oppressed. For a while, compromises kicked the can down the road and kept the volatile balance in check, as new free and slave states were roughly added in pairs. But then one loudmouth state just had to barge in and ruin everything as usual.
Texas.
The addition of Texas saw the United States enter into a war with Mexico, which they won, gaining a huge amount of land out west and creating even more problems. Hey guys, nice to meet you. I'm California, and I would like to become the 31st state. Hey buddy, welcome to the nation. We'll be happy to accept you as a southern slave state. Oh no, you don't. You're trying to get one over on us. California's gonna be a free state. Okay, listen, why don't we just ask California what it wants to be, and we can free state.
Wow, the slave state's
Well,
bald.
Then, allow me to introduce to you the territories of New Mexico and Utah, able to freely vote for slavery themselves. Hey, you can't do that! And we can enter Northern Territory anytime we want to recapture escaped slaves. What? The issue of slavery is solved, and it will never come up again. A few years later, it came up again. In 1854, a Democratic senator from Illinois wanted to build a really cool choo-choo train here and proposed that the territories of Kansas and Nebraska be created open to slavery, even though they were clearly above the Missouri Compromise line. Obviously, the northern states were like, hell no. But the Southern Democrats who controlled Congress at the time were like, well, if you love liberty and democracy so much, then you should let them vote on whether slavery should be legal or not. And so it was. Huge numbers of pro and anti-slavery settlers rushed to Kansas to sway the vote in their favor. And while they were all there, they began to beat the crap out of each other. One of those settlers was a man named John Brown, a former businessman who failed at just about everything he tried and went arguably insane. He was a radical abolitionist and dedicated much of his life to the Underground Railroad and freeing slaves. One night, in revenge for an earlier raid by pro-slavery forces, he and his sons killed a number of pro-slavery settlers in the territory, helping to kickstart years of violence known as Bleeding Kansas. Kansas and Nebraska both eventually voted in favor of outlawing slavery. But from here, the tension began to grow at a rapid pace. In 1852, author Harriet Beecher Stowe penned Uncle Tom's Cabin, a best-selling novel that exposed the terrible cruelty of slavery to the world. Oh, how awful. How morally corrupt a nation must be to allow such things to happen. Your Majesty, what should we do about all the starving children working in the coal mines? Nothing! In 1854, the Republican Party was formed, and Abraham Lincoln emerged as a leading figure. Southern Democrats viewed the new Republican Party with mistrust, believing it to be radical and abolitionist. In 1856, a politician named Charles Sumner gave a speech in Congress, calling out slave-owning Democrats with fiery language. If slavery was a woman, she'd be an ugly one, and the senator from South Carolina would like to boink her. Representative Brooks, do you have a rebuttal? Oh, I have a rebuttal, all right. Yeah, here's a rebuttal for you. Oh, come on. Surely this isn't allowed. I don't know. I'll have to consult the rulebook. I can't find anything about caning a political opponent, but it says here I'm not allowed to wear women's underwear. Uh-oh. News of the violence on the Senate floor took the nation by storm. Southern slave owners sent Representative Brooks new canes to replace his now broken one. And on the floors of Congress, politicians carried weapons in self-defense, which is never a good sign. In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott case that all people of African descent, slave or free, could not be citizens, and therefore could not sue for their own freedom under any circumstances, undoing years of progress with the strike of a gavel. Now, within all this bitter debate over slavery, there were many nuances. North versus South, Republican versus Democrat, states versus the federal government. But let's strip all of that away. For 4 million individuals living in America, this wasn't about political intrigue or party alignment. It was about the basic human right to be free. Men, women, and children were stolen from their homelands and brought to the American continent, where for generations they were considered to be property, forced to live in poverty, and work from sunrise to sunset. Plantation overseers did whatever they felt was necessary to get the most out of their slaves. Punishments were often barbaric. Families were regularly separated, and parents could often only watch, as their children were auctioned off, never to be seen again. Thousands of slaves took the treacherous risk of running away, and abolitionists in the North helped many escape via the Underground Railroad, as bounty hunters entered the North to chase them down. Leading figures within the abolitionist movement included many significant free black men and women. But it's important to note that for many of the anti-slavery white individuals in the North, opposition to slavery was often an economic issue, not a moral one, as many worried large plantations would take their lands and livelihoods away. Abraham Lincoln knew that slavery was a moral evil, and he regularly spoke out against it in powerful speeches that helped him rise through the ranks of the new Republican Party. He lamented...
Uh-oh, why are you shaking your head?
If you read the Abraham Lincoln documents,
I think I know what you're going to say.
Yeah.
He wasn't really one for one or the other. He just wanted to keep the Union together, right?
Well, at first he was just like, you know what? Whatever.
Like he mentioned, it had more to do economically. Some people look at anybody before the Civil War, and especially in the South, and these people were just inherently evil people. These people were just, so literally anything they came up with is just, we can't even look at it because these were evil, evil people. And it's just, in a lot of ways, it's just not the case. I mean, it's like moving a barge, you know, once even I'm sure a lot of slave owners started realizing like, this isn't right, but to let go of this, I literally lose everything, generations of wealth, all of my land and everything will just be gone, you know?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of similar. And again, we're not talking about human rights with this, so people won't understand this connection, but like, it's kind of like somebody saying all of a sudden one day, hey, you can't use a combustion engine anymore.
Yeah.
You just can't. You can't have a car anymore. You're just going to have to figure it out, you know? And let's say people in cities where they have railways and public, it's not going to really bother them a whole lot. People who don't live in cities, it's going to be rough because you can't get around, you know?
Right.
So like, even if you were convinced that it's evil to have a combustion engine and you're destroying the environment and all those other things, it would be hard to take that step because you literally lose your livelihood and your entire lifestyle. So again, just a little something to think about. I mean, again,
It's
slavery's
not
horrible.
taking away the horrors of what happened.
Right. But it was economic in a lot of ways because they were so deeply ingrained, and it was just how their infrastructure survived.
And just remember that it was a small percentage of the overall American population that owned slaves. Okay?
Mhm.
Please try to remember
Yeah,
that.
my family.
And the entire South was not evil.
Yeah,
There
my
were a
family was
lot
in
of
Alabama, and I
That's-
have
yeah.
records of my family farm
Dirt
back in the
poor.
1700s.
dirt poor.
I mean, they had
white
100 head of swine, I think, and that's really it.
people. Yeah.
No slaves, and I've seen the itinerary or the property list or whatever. So that was
Not everybody
Yeah.
did.
So-
So please keep that
the
in
moral of
mind.
the story is the whole concept of the whole South was evil. Every single person down there was just god awful evil. It's just not true. You know what I mean? If you're still with us, thank you.
I
If
know,
you didn't
right?
rage
Thank you.
quit,
Meant at the hypocrisy of a great American nation meant to stand as a shining beacon of freedom while also enslaving 4 million men, women, and children. He most famously declared in 1858.
So
that a
even
house
though, let me
divided
just
against
really
itself-
quick, even though you made the comment that not everyone was slave, that's a lot of slaves.
It is a lot of slaves.
It doesn't really almost
Owned by
matter.
a small percentage of
Right,
people,
it's like-
which makes it,
Yeah, it almost doesn't matter how many people. It's still a lot of people.
that's still a lot of people.
women, and children. He most famously declared in 1858 that a house divided against itself cannot stand, that one day slavery in America would end. However, even Lincoln was cautious in his opposition. He didn't want to outlaw it entirely, but simply prevent its expansion
That's what
so
you-
that
that's
given
what you're
enough
talking
time,
about,
he believed it would naturally die out. Thankfully, history would force his hand. In October 1859, one abolitionist decided he'd try to single-handedly take down slavery by force. Who would be crazy enough to even attempt such a thing?
Oh, that
It's our
guy.
good friend, John Brown. He
Robert.
planned to seize arms from an armory in the town of Harper's Ferry, free the slaves there, and continue south, inciting a major slave uprising along the way. A noble cause, a bad plan, and terrible execution. Brown's men took the armory and some hostages, but were quickly surrounded by one Robert E. Lee and his U.S. Marines. Brown was captured, and a couple of months later, he was executed for treason. Northerners sympathized with Brown, but Southerners were like, "You see this? They're coming for us. Soon, there'll be a million John Browns. A million John Browns?
Colonel Sanders.
What on earth are you thinking about? A John Brown farm? Yeah, me too. To make matters worse, new northern free states meant now the southern states really were outnumbered, and they were beginning to feel bitterly spiteful and oppressed. Further fear began to spread in the South when news broke that a
Like
relatively
he got-
unknown figure had just secured the Republican Party nomination
He's
for
gonna take
president.
our slaves.
Abraham Lincoln, mostly well-liked among anti-slavery Northerners, had made some of the most powerfully worded speeches against slavery of any politician at the time. And now, there was a chance that he and his cheekbones could become president. For the South, that would be too much. In the 1860 election, Lincoln's name didn't even appear on the ballot in 10 southern states. But much to their horror, when the final results came in, Lincoln had won by an electoral college landslide. Lincoln himself tried to calm their fear. How many times do I have to tell you, I'm not gonna take away your slaves? Yeah, right, Honest Abe. We've had enough of you Northerners. We're gonna go form our own country. You can't do that. Why not? Well, if you had won the election, would it be okay for us to leave? Of course not. Well, why not? Because that's not how victim mentality works. Many states felt that when they joined the Union, they always withheld the right to leave it whenever they pleased. Many people living in 19th century America often felt more loyalty to their state than to the nation. And now, with the South feeling like it had lost its voice in the federal government, they were out of here. South Carolina was the first to go, and over a period of 6 months, one by one, 11 slave states officially seceded from the Union, with just 4 contested border states opting to remain. The seceding states issued a number of official documents justifying their secession. South Carolina proclaimed that it was northern states' hostility to slavery that rendered the federal government illegitimate. Mississippi declared that their position
quick.
was their
Wasn't South Carolina always a problem?
I was just gonna say
Like
that.
they're always the problem. Like when it came to
they were the holdup with
Declaration of
the,
Independence.
No, they were the holdup with everything. South Carolina. It's always South Carolina.
Fucking South Carolina.
hostility
If
to
you're from South
slavery
Carolina,
that rendered the
sorry.
federal government illegitimate.
we're not sorry.
Mississippi declared that their position
shit
was
together.
thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. And in a speech, the Confederate vice president stated that the new Confederate government rested upon what he called the great truth of racial inequality. Revered American generals, such as Robert E. Lee, opted to side with their states over the Union. And with all the chaos, one New York lawyer wrote that rather than a bald eagle, America's national bird should be a debilitated chicken. And hey, I kind of like that. One man, watching the crisis
Mexico,
unfold,
it's chicken
knew
in
it would
it?
be his job to solve it. Lincoln was just about to hop on a train and become the President of the United States of America. Hey man, you're hella ugly. Grow a beard or something to hide that face.
A girl did say that.
She did.
Good
Yep.
idea.
Didn't they write in like a letters to the president or something?
Still ugly. With assassination plots already underway,
Okay.
Lincoln had Marfan syndrome, which they determined later after they did his death mask that it was actually a genetic disorder where he was exceptionally tall and he was kind of uneven.
Your
If you looked
bones
at
kinda
everything,
grow,
he
don't
was
they?
he was like
Like
crooked.
Yeah.
So that's what his lankiness, and yeah, it's actually death. Like you'll usually die from it.
Yeah, but wasn't there something like a thing where they had to write into the president and a girl wrote a
Yes.
letter saying you really need to grow a beard?
I mean, he wasn't the most attractive man, but you
Not
know,
really.
hey, to each their own, right?
Yeah.
Go marry
Beards
God.
make
traveled
everything
to
better.
Washington, D.C. under heavy disguise and protection. All along the way, he received stacks of threatening letters. May the hand of the devil strike you down. You are destroying this country. Damn you, every breath you take. Love from Grandma. At his inauguration
Grandma.
speech, Lincoln once again reiterated that no, I do not want to take away anyone's slaves. But for Lincoln, he did want to preserve the Union. He declared secession to be nothing but an illegitimate rebellion. In your hands and not in mine, he said, is the momentous issue of civil war. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. We are not enemies, but friends. It was clear Lincoln was ready and willing to get freaky and open up a can of Scatman John if he had to. Whether he had the support of the people, however,
Hell is
was in
Scatman
question.
John?
In the end, it was the Confederates that fired the first shot.
Sorry,
As they
fixing there we
seceded,
go.
the Confederate states began seizing federal U.S. property throughout the South. Off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina, was one such federal property, Fort Sumter, held by a measly, undersupplied U.S. force. The Confederate militia there demanded the fort surrender, a request which was quickly denied, and any remaining
What the
hope
heck?
for a peaceful solution to the secession crisis probably then died when the Confederates did this. The Battle of Fort Sumter is considered to be the beginning of
Was
the
that
American
just shot
Civil
around the
War.
world or something?
Many of the Confederates there
was that,
also considered it to be the end of the American Civil War. They hoped
Or
old
was that
Abe
the
would just sigh
Revolutionary War?
and say, okay, you win. Unfortunately for them, Lincoln actually said, you're about to get a roundhouse to the face. Lincoln sent out the call for 75,000
Lincoln.
volunteers, and men signed up in droves, hopeful for some adventure and good old-fashioned F-U-N. In the new Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia, Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his cheekbones had also sent out the call for 100,000 men. As ever,
That's why
both sides
everybody
hoped
grew
for a
the big
quick
chops
end to the
back then,
war.
'cause they
Is it
had
over yet?
weird
No,
cheekbones.
Jimmy, it's been 1 week. Is it over now? No. How about now?
Our kids
If you
in
ask
it.
that one more time, I swear I will turn this army around and you'll all have to go back home to your wives and children. But in particular, the South knew the conflict would pose a bit of a challenge. How can we expect to win with a population of only 5 million against 22 million in the North? If you count us 4 million slaves, you'd have 9 million. Great idea. Hand these rifles out to all the Wait a minute. You almost had me there. The problem for Lincoln was that many of his top generals were getting old and were being a bit too cautious. The commanding general was a man named Winfield Scott, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, and by now, he was too fat to even mount a horse. Okay, chaps, we need to come up with a plan. Hit me. We could wait for the Confederates to come and apologize. Maybe we should all sit in a circle and discuss our feelings. Crossing the Delaware into New Jersey worked for me. Those are all terrible ideas. And you? Wrong video.
Wrong video.
I'm the greatest president in the history of this nation. Yeah, we'll see about that, dingus. Eventually, Lincoln's generals came up with a multi-pronged strategy. First, a blockade would cut off and starve the South of supplies by sea. Secondly, taking control of the great Mississippi River would sever the South's economic artery while splitting it in two. And finally, a main Union force in the east would move south and take the Confederate capital, ending the war. Bada boom, bada bing. Skirmishes began to break out across the nation, and the Union Army in the east began to move south towards Richmond. Everything seemed to be going well until they reached Manassas, where they came upon a large Confederate force. It's almost like they were waiting for us. How did they know? As it turned out, spies in DC had sent a coded message to the Confederates warning of the invasion. Did you use NordVPN? What the heck is NordVPN?
Oh, here we go.
I'm so glad you asked. Now, where were we? Oh yeah, secession, Fat Man, and the Union invasion
Get
into Virginia.
NordVPN.
The two sides encountered each other at Manassas, and both geared up for the first major battle of the Civil War, the First Battle of Bull Run. The Confederates rapidly brought in support via rail, and the two sides were about equal in numbers. However, they were also equally inexperienced. A large number of civilians also rode out by carriage from DC to picnic on the nearby hills and watch the excitement unfold. Nobody seemed to quite understand how destructive this war was going to be. The Union forces pulled a flanking maneuver to hit the Confederates on their left, and the two sides fired on each other in rows. Farm families living in the area were forced to flee the fighting, including a man named Wilmer McLean. Hurry up, Martha! There's a war out here! The more you tell me to hurry up, the slower I will go! The Union force saw initial success pushing the Confederates back to Henry Hill. But one as of yet fairly unknown General Thomas Jackson had arrived, and he took a defensive position, standing firm like a stone wall, holding the Union army off, and finally sending them running back to Washington, D.C. With heavy casualties, the sobering reality of war hit both sides hard, and the North, having just lost the first major battle, had to face the serious prospect that they may not actually win this war. President Lincoln, General Jackson whipped us so hard, the Confederates are calling him Stonewall Jackson. Wait, that's why they're calling him that? Not because he looks like he ran face first into a stone wall? Apparently not. Worse yet, the North had also lost the first major battle out west, giving away control of southwest Missouri. All of this was terrible news for Abraham Lincoln, especially since many of his generals and cabinet already didn't have much respect for him. They felt he was incapable of running a war because he seemed a bit like your friendly old grandpa. He famously loved a long-winded story and a good pun. I've been so busy, my wife is missing me, but her aim is starting to improve. But deep down, few realized he could also be incredibly shrewd. Oh, Abe, you're so funny. Funny how? Funny like I'm a clown? Abe, I was just... No, funny how? Like I'm here to amuse you? During the war, Lincoln committed acts that were viewed by some as impeachable. His administration suppressed the free media from printing articles sympathetic towards the South. Some Southern sympathizers were even arrested without a trial. Lincoln's criticizers began accusing him of being a tyrant. But to quote the man himself, hey, it's war, baby. What are you gonna do? By the end of 1861, with things already looking bad for the North, abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass couldn't believe that the Union Army weren't enlisting black men. He continued to put pressure on Lincoln to make the war about emancipation. Mr. President, it's time to make the war about emancipation. I don't want to ruffle any feathers. The feathers are already ruffled. But Lincoln, hanging on to hope for a quick end to the conflict, continued to fight only for the preservation of the Union. It was decided, however, that escaped slaves from the Confederacy could be held as enemy contraband, and many of these men were put to work bolstering the Union's infrastructure and supply lines. Hoping to get things moving, Lincoln made young General George McClellan the new commanding general, and McClellan began to train up his men. He thought a lot of himself, however, and believed he was going to be the nation's great savior. And like many others, he didn't approve of the president's handling of the war. On one occasion, Lincoln went to McClellan's house to meet with him, but McClellan was late returning home. He kept the president waiting, and when he finally got there, he just straight up went to bed. Now that's what I call disrespectful. McClellan talked the talk, but could he walk the walk? No. Like Lincoln's other generals, McClellan was maddeningly cautious. Hey man, could you move south and attack the enemy? What? Are you crazy? What if they have a big scary army down there? They probably do. What? Oh my gosh! McClellan worried that he did not have the numbers he needed to fight effectively. What if they have like 10,000 men? Okay, no problem. We'll get you 20,000 men. Well, what if they have 30,000 men? I'll need 40. Okay, you can have 40. Well, what if they have 50? I'll need 60. Lincoln tried, but it was all in vain. McClellan would not make a move for the rest of the year. The North's one saving grace for now was a general out west fighting in Kentucky and Tennessee, General Ulysses S. Grant. Cool, collected, methodical, and a big fan of whiskey.
I was going to say he's a big drunk.
Upon himself to keep Grant sober. One officer said that Grant habitually wore an expression as though he were determined to drive his head through a brick wall and was about to do it. And that determination led him to score a number of key victories when others around him were failing. At the Battle of Fort Donelson, Grant was like, "Why does Stonewall Jackson get a cool nickname and I don't? I want a cool nickname." "Sir, the Confederates say they're ready to surrender and want to know your terms." "No terms, just unconditional surrender." Hey, unconditional surrender Grant. That's a pretty cool nickname, right? Guys, right? Later in April 1862, the Confederates launched a sudden attack on Grant's army at Shiloh, but the determined, unconditional surrender Grant threw his lines at the rebels and sent them running. The battle resulted in the heaviest casualties in U.S. history so far, and despite his victory, Grant found himself under fire. You have to get rid of Grant. Why? Didn't he win? Yes, but he just threw his men at the enemy. Isn't that the point? Also, he's a loony drunk. Well, what does he like to drink? I believe whiskey, sir. Then send him more. Lincoln watched as his cabinet did nothing but bicker, and his generals did nothing. But then, worst of all, personal tragedy struck. Lincoln's young son, Willie, very much loved by the president, died of typhoid fever at the age of 11. Lincoln was a sensitive man and was heavily affected by the loss. His wife was inconsolable. But one of Lincoln's greatest traits, what made him such a great leader, was in the darkest of times, with composure and determination, he kept moving forward. He knew it was his responsibility to hold himself and his family together, and by doing so, he hoped to hold the nation together. And he had had it with McClellan's inaction. Lincoln decided he was gonna take control. In March 1862, Lincoln firmly ordered McClellan to once again move south towards Richmond. McClellan insisted instead they move by sea to the Virginia Peninsula and attack Richmond from the southeast. Yes, said Lincoln. Okay, anything. Lincoln held on to some of McClellan's men to defend D.C. from a nearby Stonewall Jackson wreaking havoc in the Shenandoah Valley, and he sent McClellan south. McClellan landed on the peninsula, and he began to move inland. He came up against a small Confederate army that had dug in at Yorktown. McClellan vastly outnumbered the force, but it's said that Confederate General Magruder deceived McClellan by cleverly maneuvering his smaller force and making McClellan believe he faced a huge army. No, you have way more men than them. Move forward. No. McClellan settled in for a month-long siege, giving time for Johnston to move south from Manassas and Magruder time to retreat. When he
really
finally
has a
entered
big
the
army.
city and found it deserted, he declared it a victory, calling his success brilliant. Then, after meeting some resistance at Williamsburg, McClellan moved to within just 20 miles of Richmond, his armies able to hear the church bells ringing in the enemy capital. You still outnumber them. Go give him hell. No. McClellan once again held back, moving slowly and defensively, and with his army split in two, the Confederates saw an opportunity to strike back. McClellan's advance was halted, and now the Confederates pulled an ace out of their sleeve. General Lee, you're up. Do you think we should evacuate Richmond? No, Mr. President, no need. General Robert E. Lee, one of the most brilliant military commanders of the time, was now in charge. One of his biggest strengths was his ability to read the mind of his enemy, and he knew McClellan was cautious and weak. After moving Stonewall Jackson south to join him, and even though he had a smaller army, Lee hit McClellan in a series of fast-paced, close combat battles that had McClellan spooked. McClellan retreated the Union Army back again and again and again, escaping the peninsula and returning to D.C. Lee had defeated McClellan, and the campaign had failed. Well, that was a major success. A success? Tell me exactly what was successful about that. Well, we successfully retreated. You lost. I didn't lose. I merely failed to win. Things just kept looking worse for the North. At least their Navy had seen some success, capturing a number of key port cities, notably when they steamrolled past Confederate forts to take New Orleans. And speaking of the Navy, both sides had begun using ironclads. So that's pretty cool. But in the East, they still weren't having any luck. After McClellan's disastrous campaign, Lincoln briefly sent out one General John Pope to attack Northern Virginia. Hey man, just checking in. How's it going? Well, the Confederates kicked my butt at Cedar Mountain. Then they raided my camp and ran off with my money and clothes. Also, I appear to have been wedgied. Lee defeated Pope at yet another battle at Bull Run, in which nearby farm families once again got caught up in the fighting. Hurry up, Martha!
Is he still waiting for
There's
Martha?
another war out here. I'm waiting for my hair to dry. Wilmer McLean, sick of war, moved his family south, where he knew the
Does
war
anybody
would
gotta go to the
definitely,
bathroom before we
absolutely
leave?
never touch him again. But Lincoln had yet another problem to contend with. European powers, in particular the UK, were looking increasingly like they may intervene diplomatically on the side of the Confederates. They were missing their precious supply of southern cotton because of the Union blockade, and they wanted to see a swift conclusion to the war. The tension between America and Great Britain had been increasing, especially after Confederate diplomats were discovered on a British ship. Now, after McClellan's failure to take Richmond, the UK declared it impossible for the North to win. Lincoln needed something to prevent Europe from getting involved, and after more petitioning from abolitionists, he decided maybe the time was finally right to make the war about ending the institution he hated, slavery. If the North had a noble cause to fight for, Europe would be less likely to intervene. But Lincoln and his cabinet knew before they could declare something as radical as emancipation, they needed a victory, especially now that the Confederates were about to go on the attack. Aware that he had a limited number of men and supplies, Lee now hoped that if he could just threaten Washington, D.C. militarily, he would gain Europe's recognition and crush Northern morale in time for the midterm elections, forcing the North to negotiate. With confidence at an all-time high, for the first time, Robert E. Lee invaded the North. But on September 13th, the North finally had some luck. Oh boy, it's my lucky day! A cigar in a field. Hey, what's this wrapped around it? Oh my gosh! That's right, the North had discovered General Lee's battle plans wrapped around some cigars. And in them, they saw that Lee had split up his forces. McClellan headed out from D.C., and the two sides met in the Battle of Antietam, a crucial battle that would decide the course of the war. It saw the most vicious fighting to date, and still remains the single bloodiest day in American history. But, for once, the North came out victorious, and Lee was forced to retreat. He's on the run. Chase him down and finish him off. No. You know what, old buddy, old pal? You're fired.
You're fired.
The
Yeah,
North
finally.
had won their crucial victory. Lincoln breathed a huge sigh of relief, and with that win, he was prepared to take a huge step. On September 22nd, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. In January, all slaves held in the Confederate States would be, as far as the U.S. government was concerned, officially free. Throughout the North, free black men and women rejoiced, knowing that if the North were to win, their brothers and sisters would no longer be held in bondage. The proclamation also had the intended effect on Europe, who were not willing to oppose a pledge to end slavery. An outraged Confederacy knew that Lincoln had given the war a new meaning. It was no longer just about the preservation of the Union. Now, it was about
I didn't
creating
realize
a
the
new
emancipation
union,
happened
washed
before
clean
the
of
end
its
of the
original
Civil
sin.
War.
A union
Oh, cool.
without slavery.
Nice. All right, here we go. Part 2.
As the Union
Part
struggle
two.
to take control in the East continued, elsewhere, the war raged on. The Confederates attempted an invasion of Kentucky, hoping the state as a whole would join them, but they were pushed back. The Indian Territory saw Native American tribes ally with one side or the other in the hopes of securing rights after the war. Along the Mississippi, General Ulysses S. Grant remained one of the few Union generals scoring major victories. With his best pal, General Sherman, by his side, Grant led his armies down the Mississippi to the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg. Both sides knew that if Vicksburg fell, the Confederacy would be split in two, and the Confederates prepared for an intense defense of the city. But back in the East, Lincoln still wanted somebody to march south and take Richmond. Having given General McClellan the boot, he needed a new man in charge. All right, Mr. President.
This
Option
guy.
1 is General Hooker. Bit of a nutcase, but a good general. Option 2, his qualifications are his name is Burnside, and he has freaking dope-ass sideburns. Say no more. So General Burnside
I was
was
just
put
gonna
in
say he's
charge
got
of the
some
Army
chops,
of the
man.
Potomac and sent
That's
south.
great.
Lincoln hoped he finally had a general who could succeed.
Shit.
Burnside met General Lee at the city of Fredericksburg, where he intended to rapidly cross the river and take the city. But the Union War Department was too slow in delivering the pontoon bridges, and the two sides were forced to camp across from each other, close enough to speak. Hey, Yankee, ready to get your butt kicked? Yeah, right, Rebel. God is on our side. No way, God's on our side. Oh, you think so? Well, why don't we ask him? Hey, God, whose side are you on? Ow. Dude, uncool. With over 100,000 men, the Union Army finally launched their massive attack on the 11th of December. But by now, the Confederates had amassed their forces. During the battle, wave after wave of brave Union men marched headlong into a brutal Confederate onslaught. Even the Confederates couldn't believe what they were seeing, and in one moment of camaraderie, a Confederate sergeant, unable to take it, reportedly came out into the field to tend to the Union wounded. Seeing this, the Union troops held their fire. Still, Burnside and his forces were soundly defeated at Fredericksburg and forced to retreat. Lincoln's popularity and Northern morale continued to plummet, especially as the winter heading into 1863 was bad. The winter camps were rife with disease. The food was less than appealing. On both
His
sides,
face.
men began to leave. Hey, where do you think you're going? I'm deserting. What? Don't you love your country? Yes, I do. And I'm trying to get back to it as quick as I can. Lincoln, ever the kind and caring man he was, spent much of his time pardoning deserters' death sentences. Oh my, here's a 17-year-old boy sentenced to be hanged. Well, I'd better suspend his sentence. Or he'll be suspended tomorrow. What? To try to keep the numbers up, both sides had
Dad
introduced
jokes.
conscription. There was controversy in the North, however, since rich men could simply pay to have someone else fight on their behalf. Riots broke out in New York City, with enraged mobs furious at the idea of
Tony's
going
Pizza?
to fight for slaves. an idea that many of them simply did not support. However, after so much pressure, the Union had finally begun allowing black men to enlist, and these men, knowing what they were fighting for, signed up. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 troops, 10% of the Union Army, would be black. The valor and bravery they showed throughout, silencing critics. Okay, well that last guy was useless. Let's try this Hooker fellow. General Joseph Hooker was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac, and once again Lincoln ordered him to move south and take Richmond. Hooker met Lee at the Battle of Chancellorsville, where Hooker had over twice the men Lee did. Lee was forced to defy all military convention and split his smaller force into two. Lee had absolutely no chance of winning, and Lee won. It was his masterpiece. Lee did suffer one significant loss during the battle though. As his right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson, was riding back to the Confederate lines at night, the nervous Confederate troops, unable to recognize him, opened fire. You boys
The
don't
horses
do
always
dumb.
look like
Jackson
that. They
died
get the-
8 days later.
His eyes were
As
red.
for Lincoln, he couldn't believe it. It was yet another loss, and Northern support continued to waver. While the Union kept on struggling in the East, out west, unconditional surrender Grant was making moves as always. In an attempt to take Vicksburg on the Mississippi, he made a series of risky and bold movements. He sent a cavalry raid and feigned Sherman north to confuse the enemy. Then, aided by a fleet of ironclads on the river, he raced his army south to cross the Mississippi. Aware that the terrain to the north was restrictive, instead, he strategically moved northeast, hitting Vicksburg's supply line and defending his rear from Confederate armies in Jackson. Once he reached Vicksburg, the Confederate defense became hardened, and Grant was forced to settle in for a month-long siege, during which time he got rather bored. Despite not taking the city, Lincoln loved it and encouraged Grant to hold firm. It would only be a matter of time before the Mississippi was in Union hands. Around this time, the people in the west of Virginia, who had remained loyal to the Union throughout, finally broke away to form their own state. They could have named it anything in the world, but the creative minds at the time came up with
Left
the
Virginia.
ingenious West Virginia. Back in Washington, Lincoln once again wanted
That
a
was
new
when it came
general to
around?
take command.
Shit.
Oh my goodness, why do all these 19th century generals look so bust? Look, we got Sleepy Eyes Joe here. That's Princess Leia with a mustache. E.T. phoned the doctor. Fine, why don't we give Snapping Turtle McGee here a shot? General Snapping Turtle McGee was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac, and it
Oh my
was a
gosh.
crucial time for the Union, because once again, the Confederates decided to go on the attack. So far, they had done exceedingly well militarily, but as the war
Wait,
kept going,
wait.
the
Watch
Confederate
it again,
economy
wait,
was
wait, wait, wait.
crumbling.
That was
Riots
funny
broke
as
out in the
shit.
streets of Richmond as the price
I'm
of bread
crying. Wait, where is
skyrocketed.
it?
Supplies were dwindling. Put in
it
charge
here?
of the Army of the Potomac,
No.
and it was
Yeah,
a
you gotta go
crucial
back.
time for the Union.
Back further?
Because once again,
Oh, here it is.
Lincoln once again wanted a new general to take command.
Oh, this is
Oh my
so funny.
goodness,
Okay.
why do all these 19th century generals look so bust? Look, we got Sleepy Eyes Joe here. That's
Sleepy
Princess
Joe.
Leia with a mustache.
Jesus Christ.
E.T. phoned the doctor. Fine, why don't we give Snapping Turtle McGee here a shot? So General Snapping Turtle McGee was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac, and it was a crucial time for the Union, because once again,
shit.
the Confederates decided to go on the
That's
attack.
great.
So far, they had done exceedingly well militarily, but as the war kept going, the Confederate economy was crumbling. Riots broke out in the streets of Richmond as the price of bread skyrocketed. Supplies were dwindling.
guy's
Jefferson
fucking
Davis
hilarious,
wanted to
man.
send men west to rescue Vicksburg, but General Lee knew the longer the war lasted, the worse their chances got, and he still hoped if he could just threaten D.C., the already demoralized North would surrender. So in June 1863, with the momentum behind him, General Lee once again entered the North, fighting his way through Maryland and into Pennsylvania. General Meade set out to meet him for what would be the most significant battle of the entire war. If the Confederates won, D.C. could fall. If the Union won, it would be a turning point, as the Confederates would run out of steam, and the small town that was to get caught up in the crossfire of the largest battle in American history was Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. On June 1st, units from each army encountered one another and skirmished through the town itself. The townspeople were forced to take refuge, except for one man who reportedly ran outside for a strange reason. "Joseph, what are you doing?" "I'm not gonna let them take my beans." "How many times do I have to tell you they're not here for your beans?" By the second day, over 100,000 men
You know that
stretched for
shit's
miles
true,
across
too.
the battlefield. Lee took the initiative, deciding to hit the enemy's flanks, and he came very close to breaking through the Union's
They got him
disorganized left.
surrounded, though.
But
That's
Union
not
Colonel
good.
Joshua Chamberlain ordered a desperate bayonet charge, smashing into the Confederates and forcing them back. The Union forces held across the line. On the final day, Lee believed the Union Army had fortified its flanks, so he decided to finish them off with one massive central assault. The Confederates rushed at the Union lines during General Pickett's charge, and this time, it was the Union's turn to unleash hell. Meade had correctly guessed Lee's strategy, and the Confederates were decimated, forced to turn and flee. A devastated General Lee called out to his fleeing and wounded men, telling them it was his fault. And after holding for a counterattack that never came, he ordered a retreat back into Virginia. The North had just managed to score a massive victory, and one they desperately needed. And if that wasn't enough, in the West, after a month-long siege, Vicksburg finally fell. The North now held the Mississippi. And better yet, it was the 4th of July. With control of the Mississippi, Union forces moved into Arkansas and Tennessee. Tennessee in particular saw heavy fighting, with Union General Rosecrans masterfully pushing Braxton Bragg.
All right, sorry. Pizza came, so this is a long-ass video, so we're just going to eat while we enjoy. That's all right. All right, here we go.
4th of July. With control of the Mississippi, Union forces moved into Arkansas and Tennessee. Tennessee in particular saw heavy fighting, with Union General Rosecrans masterfully pushing Braxton Bragg's Army of the Tennessee out of Tennessee. He suffered a major setback, however, at the bloody Battle of Chickamauga and ended up under a Confederate siege at Chattanooga. At one point during the siege, a temporary truce was declared so that wounded men could be recovered. And often in the Civil War, during these small truces, men from both sides would meet in the middle to trade things like tobacco, coffee, and maybe even honey. Do you like honey? Me too. Bees are great. And you know what rhymes with honey? Money. Did you know honey can help you save money? Let me explain. Honey is a free browser extension that automatically finds you the best coupon codes when you buy stuff online for free. For example, so thank you. Now where was I? Oh yeah,
You're welcome.
Vicksburg, 4th of July, and the Siege of Chattanooga. Thankfully, General Grant, now in charge of all Western Union armies, showed up and karate-kicked Bragg right back into Georgia. Like this. With Sherman and Hooker, Grant took on Confederate positions in the mountains around the city, including the famous battle above the clouds and Mission Ridge. Grant continued to be Lincoln's #1 guy. With these victories, Lincoln hoped the war was finally turning. Back in Gettysburg, the entire town had been turned into a hospital to care for the scores of wounded men. Throughout the war, on both sides, women such as Clara Barton rose to the occasion, doing crucial work on the home front and volunteering as nurses for those who had given their lives. A new national cemetery was to be established at Gettysburg, and Abraham Lincoln traveled out to attend the opening ceremony. At the event, the main speaker spoke for 2 hours. Then, Abraham Lincoln was called forward to give some brief, appropriate remarks. In just 2 minutes, he masterfully and poignantly iterated America's national purpose and the need to continue the fight. The Gettysburg Address would become one of the most famous speeches in American history. While they were now making progress, the North still couldn't find a decisive victory in the East. And that was bad news for Lincoln, because his presidency was now in its 4th year. In 1864, there was an election coming. The Confederates knew this too, and with little hope left of being able to threaten the North militarily, they believed their last shot at victory may be in the election, since Lincoln, emancipation, and the war itself weren't exactly popular. People in the North were sick of war and wanted to put it behind them. Robert E. Lee hoped that if he could just hold out and continue to inflict more defeats, the people of the North would vote Lincoln out and replace him with a Southern sympathizer who may be willing to negotiate. Lincoln knew now he desperately needed a victory. Now, I know what you're thinking, but oversimplified. If Lincoln loves General Grant so much, then why doesn't he put him in charge of the campaign in the East? Well, guess what, loyal subscriber? You've hit the nail on the head. You're bold, Grant. I'll grant you that. I'm promoting you to General-in-Chief, and I ain't taking you for granted. Now I want you to go defeat Lee. Grant me my wish. Please stop. So Grant was put in charge, and he came up with a new plan. He wanted to press the Confederates on all fronts, with General Banks to capture Mobile, Alabama, General Sherman moving south to Atlanta, and Grant joining the Army of the Potomac as they advanced through Virginia. In May 1864, that plan went into action. Sherman steadily advanced on Atlanta, facing off against the smaller Confederate army under General Joseph E. Johnston. In addition, a cruel yet highly skilled cavalry general and winner of the funniest Confederate statue award, Nathan Bedford Forrest, was also nearby, doing his best to threaten Sherman's advance. But in a series of battles, Sherman dominated and pushed Johnson back to the city. But he was held just outside of Atlanta itself and was forced to lay siege. Meanwhile, nearby, doing his best to threaten Sherman's advance. But in a series of battles, Sherman dominated and pushed Johnson back to the city. But he was held just outside of Atlanta
was
itself
that there?
and was forced to lay siege. Meanwhile, the main show was happening to the
Disaster.
east in Virginia. The Union's top general was finally about to face off against the Confederacies. Lincoln hoped Grant would bring something new to the Eastern Theater, and bring something new he did. As Grant began moving south, Lee still regularly outmaneuvered him and inflicted heavy casualties, hoping to demoralize the North as much as he could. But here's what set Grant apart from others. He knew Lee was running out of men and that the North by comparison had plenty. Grant would throw his forces at Lee, and even when Lee repelled them, Grant, rather than pulling back, would give the order to keep moving forward and flank Lee, again and again. In under 6 weeks, 80,000 men would be killed, wounded, or missing. In DC, Grant was criticized for being a butcher. At the Battle of the Wilderness, the Union casualties were so heavy that Grant reportedly began to weep. But still, Grant could replace his losses. Lee couldn't, and he was being pushed all the way back to Richmond. Lee knew once he got there, he'd be under siege. Then, it would only be a matter of time. Close to Richmond, Grant again suffered horrific casualties in a miscalculated assault at Cold Harbor. Then, trying to be a trickster, instead of moving on Richmond directly, Grant moved towards Petersburg to flank the Confederate capital and cut its supply line. But, just like Sherman, Grant was halted outside of the city, and he too was forced to settle in for a siege. 2 identical sieges would not be good enough for Lincoln's re-election. The people of the North saw the casualties Grant had been taking, and they weren't happy. To make matters worse, Lee had sent Jubal Early north to threaten D.C., with the hope of forcing Grant to withdraw troops from Richmond. Early was repelled on the outskirts of the city, with President Lincoln even attending as an observer, but the North had been given a fright. So with the war currently in a stalemate, who was to be Lincoln's opponent in the critical 1864 election? Who would the Democrats choose? Guess what, baby? I'm
no
back.
shit.
That's right.
No.
General George B. McClellan would run for president against Abraham Lincoln. My fellow countrymen, if you elect me, I, the great General George McClellan, will fearlessly and valiantly win the war.
Yeah, Mr.
Unlike
No.
this douchebag, many Democrats, however, including McClellan's running mate, wanted to end the war. So it's possible McClellan may have ended up fearlessly and valiantly making peace with the Confederates, which is exactly what they were hoping for. With the war in a stalemate and Lincoln still not popular, it looked like McClellan would win, and the Confederacy may have a chance at surviving after all. Lincoln himself said that without some kind of major victory, it seemed exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected. Well, fret not, Abe, because if it's a major victory you want, it's a major victory you'll get. Atlanta had been under siege by General Sherman for just over a month. After a number of battles around the city, Sherman sent a force south to sever the city's supply line, and Confederate General Hood was forced to abandon it. Atlanta, one of the Confederacy's most important cities, had fallen into Union hands. For many, it was clear that the Confederacy's defeat was now inevitable, and the war would soon be over. When the final results came in, Lincoln had won with an electoral college landslide,
Damn.
with the troops in particular voting overwhelmingly for Lincoln, which must have been touching for their commander-in-chief. Hey man, looks like you lost. No hard feelings? I
Again.
didn't lose. I merely failed to win. In January, Lincoln involved himself heavily in ensuring the 13th Amendment made it through Congress. In a narrow and historic vote, the amendment passed. Slavery would now be constitutionally banished throughout the nation. Black men and women, watching the vote from the galleries, knew the work had only just begun. A couple months later, at his second inauguration, with victory right around the corner, he didn't celebrate, he didn't gloat. Instead, he emphasized the need for reunification and binding up wounds. To him, Americans, North or South, were to again be compatriots. However, listening to Lincoln speak that day was a man who had
Shit.
no interest
John
in
Wilkes
reunification. John Wilkes Booth, an actor living in D.C., was also a deep Southern sympathizer. And as the war turned against the Confederacy, depressed and full of hate, he was already plotting his revenge on the man he held responsible. With further Confederate losses, it was pretty clear at this point who would win. But still, Jefferson Davis showed no sign of giving in. The North were frustrated to see the conflict being dragged out. Why waste more lives? In Atlanta, General Sherman believed he had the key to forcing the Confederacy's hand. He had an unusually modern concept that an army could only survive with the support of the people. Strike at the people, and the army collapses. Sherman decided to do something unprecedented. He would remove his 62,000 men from their supply line and march through the heartland of the Confederacy, where they would live off the land. There, they would wreak havoc. As they marched, they tore up railroads, burned farms, and destroyed communication lines. They also liberated thousands of slaves. The damage done was estimated at $1.4 billion. The tactics
in
were
modern
cruel,
money.
but
Okay,
to
I was gonna say,
Sherman, it
holy
was better than losing
crap.
yet more men in battle. In December, he reached Savannah, Georgia, but he wasn't done yet. Next, he turned north to inflict his punishment
Dumb
on the
question.
first.
Do you know why that's a thing? Putting your hand inside your shirt like that in pictures? Like that?
State to secede,
Curious.
South Carolina. As he moved, he came ever closer to General Lee's army, still holding out at Petersburg. The siege of Petersburg had lasted for 292 days. 60,000 of Lee's men had deserted. Numerous Union attempts to
Holy
break through
crap,
had
that's a
failed,
lot.
but when the breakthrough finally came, it came quick. On April 2nd, a Union assault finally pushed the Confederates from their defenses. Hey man, there's no need to evacuate, right? You'll rescue us like last time, right? Sorry, can't hear you. Lee narrowly escaped the city, hoping he'd be able to meet up with General Johnson and continue the fight. Grant chased him down. Richmond was evacuated, and Jefferson Davis went on the run. As they left, the Confederates set fire to military buildings, but the flames burned out of control, and as the Union troops arrived, they became firefighters. A couple of days later, Abraham Lincoln visited the war-torn city. Grant caught up to Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, where he trapped his forces. It was here, on April 9th, 1865, that Lee saw no point in continuing. Sir? Listen, bub. I drank a bit too much last night, and now I'm hanging like a fruit bat on a hot day. So whatever you have to say, I don't want to hear it. General Lee says he wants to surrender. Hot diggity dog! Grant and Lee met in the home of a nearby farm family, owned by a man who had tried his best to escape the Civil War years earlier, Wilmer McLean. All right, can we all just hurry up and get this over with? Martha, not now!
Oh, yeah.
I'm cleaning. Do you want us to get rats? Grant and Lee, after years of war, now spoke respectfully to one another. When Lee left, his face filled with emotion, Grant's men began to cheer, but Grant ordered them to stop. He knew that now was the time for reconciliation. Just over 2 weeks later, General Johnson would surrender to Sherman, ending the war for 89,000 Confederate soldiers in the largest surrender of the war. Not every Confederate state had surrendered, but the war was as good as over. Across the North, church bells rang out and celebrations erupted. In Washington, Lincoln gave a speech from the White House to a jubilant crowd, in which, among various things, he expressed his support for black voting rights. Lincoln had seen the nation through its deepest crisis. The presidency had visibly aged him. He had lost over 20 pounds. He said sometimes, "I think I am the tiredest man on earth." I'm not sure tiredest is a word, but geez, the man's exhausted. Cut him some slack. On a carriage ride with Mary, Lincoln clearly was looking forward to being a president in a time of peace. He was apparently very cheerful, surprising his wife, and he told her that between the war and the loss of their son, they'd both been very miserable. Now, it was time to be happy.
Time to go
On the
to
evening
a
of April
theater.
14th, Lincoln attended a play with his wife and some friends at Ford's Theater. It was a comedy, and the president appeared to be enjoying it very much. In a nearby bar, John Wilkes Booth swallowed 2 glasses of brandy. He slipped quietly into the president's booth and awaited for the audience's laughter to rise.
Boom.
The president was shot in the back of the head. Booth fled the city. Soldiers carried Lincoln to a boarding house across the street. There, doctors declared there was nothing they could do. Surrounded by his heartbroken wife, son, and members.
This is the kind of shit that I notice, okay? What is very poignant about what he decided to do here? The maker of these videos. I need to know his name. I want to like interview this guy and hang with him. Dude's amazing.
Are you talking about the painter?
What I'm saying, no, the one who makes these videos. This is the first time we're seeing something besides the goofy art that he uses. And you notice all the sound effects stopped. Very somber, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
I mean, it's just
I did
very
wonder,
cool
like,
decision by him.
Probably for the sake of like YouTube, he couldn't do the bullet shot or something because
I don't know about all that. I mean, God, we saw people killing emus and like destroying. You know what I mean?
Right.
I think it's just it's a very unique artistic choice where everything is goofy and like this, but at this point he decides to
Booth and awaited for the audience's laughter to rise.
I didn't see that. I feel like I didn't see it. Okay, but now watch. It's quiet.
The president was shot in the back of the head. Booth fled the city.
And now they show
Soldiers
true,
carried
like,
Lincoln
paintings.
to a boarding house across the street. There, doctors declared there was nothing they could do. Surrounded by his heartbroken wife, son, and members of cabinet, at 7:22 the next morning, President Lincoln passed away. Never before had a president been murdered. A shocked nation mourned as a 12-day funeral procession carried Lincoln back to his home in Springfield, Illinois. On April 26th, Union cavalry found John Wilkes Booth in a barn in Virginia, where he was shot. Not long after, Confederate President Jefferson Davis was also tracked down and arrested. Imprisoned for 2 years, he was eventually released. The North didn't want to put him on trial for fear the jury may rule that Southern secession had in fact been legal. To ensure reconciliation, other Confederate generals and politicians were allowed to re-enter life in the now restored Union. Scattered fighting continued into May, when the last Confederate forces in Texas disintegrated. The Southern states came under Northern military occupation to prevent any further rebellion, and a very difficult era of Reconstruction began. Over 3 million Americans had fought, brother against brother. The Civil War remains the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history, but the Union had been preserved. You could say the real winners were those who were to never again be slaves. Further amendments passed by Congress gave black individuals the right to citizenship and to vote. Significant progress had been made. However, entering into the 20th century, it was clear the fight for equality would continue. In modern America, the man who fought to preserve the nation and never gave up in the darkest of times stands as a symbol of honesty, empathy, humility, perseverance, and courage. A continuous reminder of what has forged America and what it should ever strive to be.
It's a very nice outro.
So, couple
Is it
things.
over? Wait, is it over?
It's over.
Okay.
No,
Wait.
I actually
Okay.
I have seen the bed that Lincoln died in.
Really?
Very small. Beds were very small, very narrow, like not even like the size of like a twin bed with it was at the Chicago History Museum.
Oh, okay.
And it was amazing. So they had like the cover and like it was very interesting to see. Also the train that Lincoln, so they did a tour with a train. I actually had a fellow grad student do an entire thesis paper on the Lincoln Memorial Train. It was brilliant. But when he was buried in Springfield, people kept trying to get in and grave rob. They wanted to steal his body. So they kept having to put him in concrete. And finally I believe he's in Washington. I don't think he's in Springfield anymore because too many people kept trying to, a couple people, they thought they succeeded, Confederate people. But yeah, they wanted to steal his body. Pretty cool.
Yeah. I want to say when we went to
Galena.
Galena, wasn't there a hotel
Yes.
where he did a tour and he gave an address out the
Mhm.
window and there's pictures of it and
Yeah,
everything. And
we ate at
and
that
it's the
restaurant.
same hotel, right?
Yep.
Like it's, yeah.
Right by the train station. It was super cool. Galena, Illinois, if you ever get a chance to go, it's on the far upper western portion.
Yeah.
It's just this little bitty,
It
gorgeous
is
town.
beautiful. And it's where Grant lived, right?
Grant lived
He
there.
was born there or he lived there after
He
the
lived
war?
there after the war.
Okay, yeah.
There was a big, beautiful brick house that was his that now you can go through and do tours, and there's still things that were there of his.
That's one of our
I didn't
first
see a lot of
dates.
whiskey bottles though.
Yeah, I know, right?
But we stayed actually in a mansion. It was a B&B, just so you know.
It was one of our
We
first
can't afford a
dates.
mansion. Yeah, it was our
Yeah,
first getaway
that
as a
was
couple.
amazing.
And we celebrated our first wedding anniversary there.
Yes, we did.
But Galena's beautiful. If you ever get the chance, spring is a wonderful time to visit. The town kind of opens up. Fall's great too. There's a lot of rich history. And now that we live in Florida, I am itching to see the history of Florida.
Yeah.
Because I've lived in
One of the
Illinois,
oldest
Indiana, and
areas.
Wisconsin. And I'm itching to see the South.
Well, and
I
of
love the
course,
South.
oldest area, like, right? I mean, people have lived there forever, right? But like, just when it comes to like, settlers and things
I'm
like
just
that,
a history
it's-
geek.
Yeah.
On our
yeah.
wedding, I made you do 2 weeks of history. I thought you were going to kill me at
Well,
the
it's
end.
just castle
He's like,
after
I don't want to do
castle
any more
after,
history.
it was amazing.
But as far as the Civil War goes, if you ever get the chance to visit these locations, you know, don't look at it in a hateful way. We cannot change the past. It's us moving forward. We look at the past, we can learn from it, we can appreciate where it's brought us, because if those events didn't happen, where would we be right now?
Yeah.
So try not to judge history with a 21st century lens. Everything was different back then. And especially if you get the opportunity to do some research into your family genealogy, ancestry.com, there are plenty of others, you know, you may find out that your family may very well have been from the South. You know, like we said, his family, dirt poor farmers. You know, you found a pension from one of your relatives. But again,
a Confederate Army pension.
If they didn't have slaves, particularly, they were fighting for states' rights. They fought for states' rights, and they fought to preserve what they had, their lifestyle, their farms, their family. And when you notice, when you look at that map, where were 99% of the battles fought? In the South. So they had a lot to lose, and the North had a lot to gain. And that's why if there's a video on Reconstruction, you had to tread lightly with it, because people had to rebuild, people were poor. You had, you know, former slaves that just didn't know what to do and where to go because they didn't have anything but the clothes on their backs. So, you know,
they're just kind of like, hey, have fun, you know, and they're like, yeah.
And that's what Lincoln did. Yeah, he was like, okay, you're free. They're like, well, where do we go? He's like, I don't care. Anywhere, not here. Find somewhere to go. You're free. Do whatever you want.
And that's why it was just a starting point in a long journey to equality. So.
Right.
Wow. Well, we know this is a long, super long video.
Right.
So thank you. I mean, thanks for, if you stuck around this long, God bless you. Holy crap.
You.
But yeah, whoever bakes these, I don't think anybody truly understands how much goes into this.
And I appreciate all that he does.
Like, just the bullshit editing that I do for these videos.
A long time.
It takes a long, I mean, and to make all this from the ground up and all just the goofy little jokes that he threw in there. I mean, that takes time to put that in there. So props to you, man. Whatever and never mind, he's hilarious and obviously very intelligent, knows a lot about history. Way more than I'll ever.
He does good summations.
Oh, it's incredible.
Good way of breaking it down.
Yeah. And again, from an artistic point of view, I really like the end there, because this is the first video out of like 4 or 5 I've seen where he broke away from his style of animation and made it somber and quiet and just showed true like paintings and depictions of what happened, right? So very respectful. You know, there wasn't like, hey, I'm going to draw this little like, you know, bullshit animation of his funeral. And this, I mean, It was the real deal. So it showed a great deal of respect in that matter. So just a very good artistic choice with that. So
learn the history. Don't judge it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And real quick too, like one of the biggest things you learn as a historian, like when you go and you actually get a history degree, is simply to just not judge a group of people based on a modern lens. It's a lot more objective than that. You know, and you learn the facts, like she said, you learn the facts, and you kind of learn that people's mindsets and their litmus test for what was moral and not moral is very different. You know, like what if 500 years from now we determine that eating meat is that's just evil?
Yeah.
And that's just never, you know, so people in the future are going to be like, that's absolutely unheard of to eat animal meat. That's crazy.
And abhorrent. I can't believe they would do that.
And to turn around and look at people who actually eat steak as they're just inherently evil people. Yeah. You see how unfair that is, you know what I mean? So, you know, not to make light of it, but it's, God, we're getting too deep into this and people are going to lose their shit. But you get what I'm saying.
It's a good thing, you know.
Yeah. There's different litmus tests. We're constantly moving as a society as what's acceptable and what's not, you know, and it changes all the time. So,
yes. And we appreciate what has come out of it so far. You know, the civil rights movement was amazing. You know, Martin Luther King Jr. taken way too early. Mm-hmm. Could have done a lot of amazing things for the world. And that's the generation we grew up in, you know. Yeah. We were following Dr. King. So, you know, love one another. Don't be judgmental and learn what you can.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we'll see you in the comments. Be nice, please. And we'll see you in there. And until then, be safe, healthy, and be nice to each other.